Taking care of tomatoes takes daily work for sure. I'm out here every morning and I'm spending probably an hour with my plants, making sure that they have everything they need, keep them happy and healthy. Here are some of the basic things that you need to keep in mind to get a really good, healthy tomato crop that'll keep giving until the fall. The first thing you want to make sure you do is to use a big enough pot. I really like these 15-gallon pots. You could go with a 10-gallon pot if you're growing in plastic, but in these smart pots, I find that, actually these aren't real smart pots, these are cloth pots. I recommend smart pots because they don't rip like these cheap thin ones from Amazon. But anyway, in cloth pots, I find that a 15-gallon size, to when I get to full-size plants in the summer, they are big enough to make sure that the plant gets enough moisture to last through the day. If you go with smaller cloth pots, you may find that they're very, very dry by the afternoon and you have to water them twice. So these 15-gallon pots, the plants have plenty of room to stretch out. The roots go right to the bottom, and they also have enough soil in there that I can water them once a day, and they're very, very happy. Going along with that, you want to water them deeply every day. Tomatoes like deep watering and lots of water. In the height of the summer, I'm giving these plants a few gallons every day. Right now, we're doing about a gallon a day, and the plant's very happy. Another thing you want to do is remove suckers. So little extra tomato vines that are growing off of your plant can just be removed to manage the wildness and vininess of your plant. So you can see in between the main stalk and branches are suckers. That's a secondary vine that's going to grow up and become just as big and healthy as the main vine of the plant. You want to get rid of those unless you want a real wild plant, and you can just pinch them right off. And you can actually, if you have longer suckers, you can transplant those and get more tomatoes. So I've got a few suckers that I'm letting go a little bit that I'll either transplant or remove later, and I'm just letting the plants take shape a little bit. But I've removed all of the lower suckers, and I've also cut off a lot of the lower branches. And the reason for that is you want to keep your tomatoes dry. You don't want your branches in the soil, and you don't want them to get wet. What happens pretty quickly is that the plants get fungus, mold, and mildew, and will quickly wilt and get damaged. And you can get infections that will spread to the whole plant and to the whole garden. So as soon as you start seeing the leaves go downward, that's time to start trimming them. So what I often do is trim half of the leaf off like that, and let the healthy part of the leaf stay on there. You can see where they're already damaged. I'm going to trim them off. Don't have my clippers with me like usual, but I've got fingernails. And I'm going to come back with my clippers and get these two, and I'm going to cut those two lower leaves off, three actually, entirely. And you don't have to worry because those plants are going to get real tall. So the next thing that you want to do with your tomatoes is support them. I'm using this string system, which I'm running on a steel cable and reinforced wood arbor that I built. And these tomatoes all together, that's a dozen tomatoes, that's going to weigh well over 100 pounds in the middle of the summer, maybe more like a couple of 100 pounds. And hopefully these single strings will be enough. If they're not, I'll have to start adding strings to carry the weight. Okay, I'll be right there. It's time for lunch. Isn't that a great thing? You don't hear that too often anymore, somebody yelling down the street, time to eat. So supporting your tomatoes is really important to keep them growing nice and straight. Otherwise, tomatoes really vine and they will go in all sorts of directions. You can use stakes, but it's a little tricky to manage them with stakes. A lot of people use the tomato cages, which is fine. I'm using this method because we're growing indeterminate tomatoes, which means that they'll just keep growing and growing and growing. And what will happen is, as I harvest the tomatoes off of the lower vines, the upper vines will keep producing, and the vine will get longer and longer and longer. As the vine gets longer, if it gets longer than that 8-foot tall here, then I let out the string and I let the vine down, and I can gather the bald vine at the bottom. I can just let gather around the bottom of the pots and continue letting the vine grow longer and longer and longer. So I've got 8 foot of space here, but I may very well by the end of the summer have 20 or more than 20 foot long vines, because I've been letting the string out and coiling the used up vine at the bottom. So we'll see how that all goes later in the summer. So another thing you want to make sure that you do is feed your plants. That's one of the main things that separates a successful harvest from a less successful harvest is fertilizer. So at this stage of growth, I'm giving them lots of nitrogen-based fertilizer for veggie growth, but I'm also giving them flowering fertilizer. And importantly, with tomatoes, you have to make sure that your fertilizer has lots of calcium and magnesium in them. So if you don't, you have to add CalMag. You can also, if you're don't have the time, you can use an emergency method of adding powdered milk and watering it in. But calcium is really critical, and if you get the blossom end rot, which is where the end of the tomato starts to go bad, that's due to calcium insufficiency or lack of calcium uptake. That's the issue that we have here. We use a calcium chelator because in the summer it gets so hot that the plants start having a hard time absorbing the calcium. So no matter how much you give them, they're going to have a hard time absorbing it. So you may need an extra amendment in order to handle that, depending on where you live. So these plants were a little late to get hung up, and you can see this one in particular, it started to vine sideways. It was laying on its side a little bit because I was a little late at getting the string. And that can really happen, that tomatoes will grow along the ground. If you don't tie them up or stake them up, they will end up being a vining plant along the floor. So depends on how you want to grow them, but this is the way that the professionals do it. So it's been real windy here, so I haven't had to do it, but you also need to pollinate your tomatoes. Tomatoes are self-pollinating, but you still have to help them a little bit by just tapping the flowers like that. And you can even vibrate the whole plant, and that'll be enough to let the pollen drop to where the plant can pollinate, and you'll get your fruit going. And that's an important step. A lot of people have great tomato plants, but they don't get good enough pollination, and so they're not getting enough fruit. So I'm out here every morning when I water. I'm also tapping the tomatoes and making sure that those flowers get pollinated. It's been really windy here, so I haven't been doing it for the last few days. But it's also an important thing to do in the morning because pollination will be more successful before the heat of the day. You don't want to pollinate later in the day. I always recommend self-pollinating plants of any type. I've had to grow cucumbers and melons that needed to be pollinated, and it's not so easy to hand pollinate. You have to really keep on it. So those are my tomato tips for today. I have another video that shows how I go around and get those suckers. So you want to clip those suckers. Cut your downward facing leaves. Cut any damaged leaves that you see. Any leaves that you see, I'm going to come back with my clippers today, because any leaves that you see, those are insect eggs possibly. Have to look under magnification to see it clearly. But you cut those damaged leaves off because a whole plant can get infected very, very quickly, and those infections can spread to the whole garden. So keep your tomatoes out of the dirt, keep those leaves dry, and keep watering them heavily every day with lots of fertilizer, and you will have happy plants. If you do get insects, then try one of the organic sprays. They're based on peppermint or chrysanthemum flowers. There's a few different products that are all natural sprays that get rid of aphids and the other insects that may get to your tomatoes. And watch out for rodents and birds and animals that may eat your tomatoes. If you see bites taken out of your tomatoes, it could be an animal that's getting in them, not necessarily an insect. So that's my tomato tips for today. Hope you have a great and healthy harvest. Please subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think. If you have any questions, any specific concerns you have for your tomatoes, and if you stay on it, you will have happy, healthy plants that will go for months and give you lots and lots of tomatoes. Keep watching my videos, because as we go through the season, I'll give you more tips as they come up, as the plants mature.